there is a feel-good effect of aid. You feel good about it. It comes from our traditions, all religious traditions, Christian, Islam, Hindu, talk about helping those who need help. So that's not a bad concept. So you feel good about it. So when governments say to the people that we are giving development aid to Africa, they feel good about it. They feel as if they are participating in alleviating suffering in Africa. So, but that is a complete myth. There is a total, it's an abstraction from reality. It doesn't translate into what it promises. On the contrary, opposite of that. But before I go into the opposite, I would differentiate between relief aid, okay, when there's earthquake and people are suffering, then you bring out some kind of assistance, but I just simply call it relief assistance. And I would also separate genuine humanitarian aid. If people are coming from Africa or from Middle East as refugees, then you assist them, then it's okay. But that's not what development aid is. Development aid as defined by the OECD, Organization of Economic Community for Development, is a very precise concept. And that concept sees that you give a concessional loan to developing countries at lower than market price of interest. And this will then increase their ability to grow, and out of that growth will come, okay, well-being for the people. Now that is a total lie. It doesn't operate like that. On the contrary, with aid comes conditionalities. Now I think European audience will understand with Greece that with aid coming from the European Commission and the IMF and the bank, okay, it brought conditionalities, austerity. And what austerity has done for Greece is basically to enslave the people of Greece and to basically turn their assets as collaterals that banks will pick up, and Greece is literally turned into colony. Now what is happening to Greece over the last 1 year, or 5 years actually, by the way, has been happening to Africa for 30 years. Development aid is a war on Africa. And that's what I've described in my book. Also, it's a war. So I think your audience should appreciate the importance of making a distinction between genuine assistance, charity, and so-called development aid. Because development aid is definitely war on Africa. You use the word failure. People think it's just a fail. The system has failed, and therefore perhaps something can be done to reform it, basically. That word is very critical, failure. No, it's not failure. It's the essence of the system. It's the quintessence of the system. It is the function of aid. So they are not failed. Aid has succeeded brilliantly. They succeeded in undermining our economies to make our economies subservient to the needs of corporate capital. So they are able to get cheap commodities from Africa because through conditionalities they have forced us to open our markets, and the capital comes to take our land from our countries, resources from our countries. No. Aid has succeeded brilliantly. Why should they reform it? They don't want to reform it. It's working very well for them. It's an imperial tool. That's what the concept that was worked out by the OECD. First within OECD, and then it was taken to the United Nations. And the UN accepted that concept of aid effectiveness. And they had numerous workshops on this. I attended 1 or 2 of them in OECD in Paris. And I found that I found that they had once again thrown a concept, effective, which nobody can refuse. You see, this is the problem about concepts. They are so appealing that ordinary people cannot refuse them. Now, who would not want to make aid effective? So then they set up a whole lot of structures to make it effective. And it was going to be, for example, the relationship between donor and recipient countries, bringing about mutual accountability. Wonderful principle. There should be mutual accountability. Who will reject that concept, mutual accountability? In practice, nothing. Simply accountability of the recipients to the donors. The donors never accountability to the recipients at all. So the whole thing was built on total hypocrisy. Cynical. Completely cynical. So I attended the Busan conference, and I was probably the only one talking against that, because the OECD had co-opted NGOs from the South, non-governmental organizations from the South. And there were literally 100 of them, there are 300 or 400 of them, organizations with 300, 400 individuals who had bought into the idea of effective aid. And they served the purpose of the OECD to legitimize that concept of effective aid. And I came out against that because I had a pamphlet called Demystifying Aid. No, that thing is gone already. Nobody anymore talking about effective aid because, once again, effective for whom? Effective not for us in developing countries. Effective only for those who supply money, like in Greece now, to make aid effective for them. So we are still back to square one. Our battle still continues to fight against aid. One has to understand the United Nations system, how it operates. The United Nations is an intergovernmental body. Governments send their representatives to negotiate. And they negotiate on the basis of a text. The text is produced by a bureaucratic team of experts within the UN system. And already from the start, the bureaucrats within the UN system tend to produce a text that is acceptable to the bigger players. Because the UN system, the big and powerful, are the ones who more or less dictate what takes place in the UN. Except sometimes in General Assembly there's a bigger debate. But when it comes to declarations like the MDGs and financial development, these are very specific issues. There, the texts are written by bureaucrats influenced by the big and powerful. Now, on that text for months on end, they negotiate in Geneva or in New York. And then there is bargaining. For example, on the MDGs, when it started, there were statistical concepts in which the text was worded. On education, we must achieve that much by 2015, on health, like that. Okay. Now, the countries of the South raised one critical issue. They said, well, these are concrete issues. We'll agree to them, provided you put a 10th one, which is that we have to look into the system as well, the global system. So they negotiated that, and then the Americans and Europeans said, okay, we'll put the 10th one on systems, but what we ought to concentrate on are these statistical measurements. So that's the UN system. In other words, it's always a compromise. And in that compromise, the big and powerful always win the battle. Then it comes for endorsement. When it comes for endorsement, because it's a negotiated text, people endorse. And then comes the application of that. When it comes to application, there's again the entire UN Secretariat set up, the OECD, structures there. There are aid donors who put their requirements to countries that are recipients of aid. And then they begin to do what? Measurement of those statistical things. And nobody talks about the 10th one, the systems. The very cause of the poverty, root cause of poverty, is never addressed. So then our bureaucrats collecting data on those statistics. And in the meantime, poverty is increasing. Okay, the whole thing is a drama. It's a diplomatic drama. And there's a reality behind that. You cannot dismiss diplomatic reality also. There's a reality behind that. Reality of power. You see? That's totally abstracted from real reality, existential reality of the people. The existential reality is that people, okay, in Africa, for example, or the 10 years of period of MDGs, okay, have lost. They become more impoverished now than before, overall. And the statistical, okay, indices hide the fact that Africa's economies have been devastated by the neoliberal austerity measures imposed on us. That's the reality. So, my answer to your questions, okay? This is background. You have to understand this background. Against this background, they have Finance for Development conference in Ethiopia. The text is prepared beforehand. There's 3 days or 4 days of meeting. And everybody, the delegates have already agreed in Geneva or in New York, this time in New York. That's it. And they rubber stamp it. Same with the new one, the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, it's now broader than the MDGs. It is negotiated. There are now over 90 or so elements there. It's a hodgepodge of all kinds of things. Negotiated. A diplomatic document. Same as before. It has no bearing on the real existential reality on the ground. Nothing. Total abstraction from reality. So my answer to your question, both are bogus and they will go where others have gone. In other words, nothing will happen. The SDGs will go the same way as the MDGs. Poverty will continue. Our people in Africa will be thrown out of their own lands. They'll be thrown out of their own survival strategies. Millions of people in Africa will be dispossessed, impoverished, and potential refugees. Those who are able-bodied will leave our countries to come to Europe. Europe hasn't seen anything with what they have seen in the last 1 year or 2 years. They have not seen anything. They are going to get massive numbers of people from Africa. Come over there. They may put hotspots there, they might prevent them from coming. They will fail because they have not addressing the root causes that create misery in our continent. These are just diplomatic negotiated texts which are meaningless completely. Well, like I talked about aid and issues of aid and MDGs and so on, the problem begins with the concept. And the concept is free trade or even fair trade. You see, when you use these kind of concepts, ordinary people, ordinary citizens would automatically say, but what's wrong with free trade? His trade should be free. And what's wrong with fair trade? Okay, free trade has problems, let's make it fair. Let's give the cocoa farmers in Ghana or the coffee farmers in Ethiopia a better price, you have fair trade. So the difficulty is that these concepts are so appealing, so good to feel about it, that the global corporations use these concepts very cleverly to buy in support for the ordinary citizens. Until you begin to now analyze what lies behind it. First of all, free trade doesn't exist ever. It never has existed, free trade. It simply is a myth. It's an ideology. It's an ideology. Even, as I was saying before, even during the height of English mercantile period, 19th century, there was no free trade. No. There was an imperial trade by Britain with, say, America, in which the Americans produced tobacco and whatever the British wanted, and the British produced manufactured products until at the independence struggle of America. The leadership, political leadership in America said, no, we don't want free trade. If that consigns us to be forever producers of raw materials, we want to also industrialize. So America was the first country to begin protection. And then after that, Germany also started protecting against the British free trade. So then other countries followed, Switzerland, all of Europe, France, all these countries, and Japan. All these countries developed not on the basis of free trade, but on the basis of protection of the industries. The irony is, now that they all developed, they have now formed a coalition of the imperial countries, and talking to us in the developing countries, let's have free trade. Completely contrary to their own history. So there's nothing like free trade. So that's the first thing that I try to explain in my book, that free trade is not free. And trade, since the beginning of capitalism, it's not that trade is always war. There have been trade between India and Africa, China and Africa for thousands of years. The Indians or Chinese never colonized Africa. It's when the European civilization became the dominant civilization. It began with slave trade of human beings. And what you had, slavery before was not trade as such. Slavery in Roman Empire and so on. There was slavery as a system of production. But slavery, human beings as traded as commodities, began with European civilization. And then, of course, came capitalism. And in the name of trade, they went to England for trading and colonized them. England went to India for trading, they colonized India. They went to China to trading and had opium wars to oblige China to trade with England. War. Trade has been war for 500 years. Relentless war, unceasing, unstoppable. And that is what my book is about. And my book does not derive evidence from other books. It's not an academic book. No. I am drawing this from experience. I've been involved in trade negotiations for over 10 years, more than 10 years. And I've been involved in negotiations on economic partnership agreements with Europe for even longer. And what I know from personal involvement in negotiations, that what Europe and America and Japan are doing to Africa, I cannot use any other word, is war. It's a relentless war. And we'll fight, our people are suffering because of that war. And that war is killing more people than drones. Drone attacks can kill a few people on the ground. But trade kills millions of people on the ground. Worse than drone attacks. So this is what my book is about, and I have chapters on World Trade Organization, on economic partnership agreement, on intellectual property rights, which is another form of war on us, because intellectual property should never have been privatized. This intellectual property belongs to humanity. Europeans developed on the basis of borrowing knowledge from past civilizations, including our own civilization, Hindu civilization. I'm a Hindu, an Islamic civilization. It was free. When capitalism came, they turned it into a property. They had to pay for it. in the market. And that has become another form of war on Africa. So the pharmaceutical companies can produce drugs which can help us in Africa to fight against diseases, HIV for example. But because they are produced under patents filed in by pharmaceutical companies, the prices are so exorbitant that people can't pay. So the corporations would rather have the people die of HIV than reduce the price of pharmaceutical products. They kill. The pharmaceutical industry is supposed to save people. No, they kill because they want profits. No. This system is totally uncivilized. This civilization that we have is barbaric. It's barbarism. I think we in Africa, in the South, can for once take an opportunity with the crisis in Greece and the whole debate about TTIP. We can take that opportunity to now put forward what we knew for 30 years. Nobody was listening to us in Europe. Even the left was not listening to us because Africa was too far. They were concerned too much about their own problems, European unity and all that. Now, the situation has changed. Greece has been subjected to austerity measures in return for money that they are getting from the Trinity, from European Union, the bank and the IMF. And we know what the outcome of that is. Syriza came into power on the basis of popular support. And on the referendum, 60% of them said no to the austerity measures. Then Syriza was subjected, poor Tsipras, was subjected to such huge pressure, as you know, in Europe, in Germany, that he was obliged to accept the terms. And he was obliged to go back to elections. Because what can he do? What could he do? He couldn't do anything. So he went to elections. Of course, we know the results of the elections. Syriza has come to power, but split. So there's division. Okay, let's summarize. The empire rules. Europe is an empire. Germany is the top imperial power within Europe because it is the most industrialized country with huge finances. They give money on conditions that we know, austerity. If you do not accept those conditions, okay, then they shut down the banks. The banks closed down in Greece, and the people could not even have access to ordinary money. Sanctions. Okay? Greece surrendered. Small country had to surrender. Okay? And Greece is practically colonized. Now that is austerity measures which have been imposed on us for 30 years in Africa. And what Greece is today, we have been suffering for 30 years. We have been enslaved by those who impose austerity on us, IMF, the donors. So that's where we have been 30 years. Now TTIP. The trade, the transatlantic trade investment treaty, agreements, TTIP, partnerships. It's a partnership called between corporate America and corporate Europe. The effects of that will be disastrous, no question about that. Disastrous. Because corporations, even in Europe, might benefit from that, but at the cost of ordinary citizens. For example, on health issues, the TTIP will demand national treatment for professionals coming from America to Europe as well. And there'll be competition between, say, English practitioners and American practitioners. But that's beside. This is one of the small issues. The bigger issue is military. I have traveled around Europe since TTIP debate started, and I have found that the debate is focused either on economics, like what will happen to your economies, or on litigation, the investment state dispute settlement, ISDS. So they are focused purely on economic and the ISDS issues. Both are quite serious, because ISDS, basically, you know what happens. The jurisdiction will be removed from state judiciary to a body created outside of the state in order to litigate disputes between state and the corporations. So your states will lose sovereignty. Okay, but so that debate I am aware of. But what is lacking even in European debate is the military dimension. It's not there, not discussed. You have to look at the TTIP with a broad geopolitical angle. And that angle is that the TTIP is aimed at whom? Guess whom? China. China. Is the Chinese threat that Obama has put to your governments in Europe to say that if you do not come together in this agreement, then we are in danger of a market being taken over by China. And in fact, China becoming such a big power that we may face security danger also from China. Russia, for the time being, in Ukraine, in these countries, Balkans, but for the time being, but in 10, 15, 20 years' time, China. So that is the perspective of NATO. So, and of course, all Europeans are members of NATO, except country like Norway. That angle is not being discussed in the media. That TTIP is only the other side of NATO. Same coin. You flip it, NATO, other side, TTIP. TTIP is the economics side of NATO. And the dominant relationship in that is NATO, not economics. That debate is not there. I can only analyze what is taking place now for the last 10 years, but I can't make projections for the future right now. What is taking place at the broader geopolitical level is what I call tectonic shift. The shift. As I mentioned earlier, this famous writer called Huntington talked about a clash of civilizations, and I don't agree with him because the word clash makes it so dramatic, and the implications are militaristic, that the Western civilization must fight back Islamic civilization, all that, that language. No, what's happening is a shift of civilizations, tectonic shift. The European civilization is dying. It has had its day, 600 years of civilization. It did make its contributions during its height. We never seen such a massive development of technology and science, except under capitalism. So there's a fantastic positive side during the creative phase of capitalism. That's true. But now capitalism has entered into a very negative phase, destructive phase. Why? Because while the science is developing, technology is developing, these underlying social relations are not. Underlying social relations remain capitalistic, exploitative, exploiting working class, exploiting weaker nations. That has not changed. Okay, so you have to understand the larger dimension of history. But we are now moving into history where there is resistance now from below. Increasingly from our own countries in the south. So they struggle for national liberation. And we were able to fight against the empire, British Empire in our countries, or French Empire in Africa, French and British empires. And we gained a certain amount of political freedom, but not economic freedom. So go to our countries, practically everything of value is still owned by former colonies, former imperial countries, Britain, France, and so on. Multilateralized. The United States is part of that, Japan, and so on. Okay, so that's the background. Okay, now we are looking at emergence of new forces. And of course, these forces work at different levels. At the topmost level is the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. At the lower levels is, like my country, Uganda. They are called LDCs, least developing countries. They have layers of them. Okay. Now the BRICS countries have been trying to change the system of global governance. In the UN system, in the IMF, in the World Bank, in the WTO. They're not getting anywhere. They're not succeeding. The United States will not allow China, which is now quite a big economic player, a proportionate say in the IMF. Only last week there was discussion between Obama and the president from China. They met in New York. They're discussing about how the yuan, the Chinese coin, currency, could become part of the spatial drawing rights in the IMF. But the Americans are not agreeing to that. So the empire is sitting on a dying empire. The powers that are controlling the structures are sitting on a dying empire, trying to preserve that and not allowing emergent forces to have proportionate share in global governance. So there's a clash, that kind of clash shift. So what are the BRICS doing? They're creating their own banks. They met in Pretoria about a year or 2 years ago. They created the Bank of the South. So we have created our own banks. China has created its own bank called the Infrastructure Bank. And they are in a position to leverage more amount of credit, funding, to build infrastructure development in our countries, roads, railways, energy, and so on. And the irony is that now practically every country has joined this infrastructure bank that China has created, except who? United States. Even England joined it. Israel has joined a member of that. United States, no, United States can't leave this imperial domination. So it's a big question you asked me, a very big question. But for sure, the days are ending for the American empire. And I want to end there. The sad part is that the more the Americans cannot have their say in the economic level, the more militaristic it will become. And they are now succeeding in militarizing the global system. And I now just was talking to our friends here. I was amazed to see that Europe has also joined America. Well, Europe is taking the lead in this one, to militarize even the refugee situation. So when the refugees come here, instead of having police, they have army people checking them coming into Europe, trying to send them back. And now Europe is trying to put hotspots, so-called, into Africa to prevent people from coming to Europe. They are militarizing a genuine problem of refugees. And they're not gone to analyze the root causes of why things are happening the way they're happening. It's a serious blind spot amongst the ruling classes in Europe and America. They are not addressing issues. It's a dying empire.